Welcome to the Deep Dive, your shortcut to being well-informed. We cut through the complexity, extracting the most critical insights from the world's most influential discussions. Today, we're taking you straight to the heart of the global economic debate, Jackson Hole. We've been diving deep into the key addresses from central bank leaders, people like Christine Lagarde of the European Central Bank, Jerome Powell from the Federal Reserve, and Kazuo Ueda from the Bank of Japan, along with various news commentary. These aren't just formal speeches, they're really a crucial window into how global policymakers are grappling with an economic cycle that is, well, truly unique.
Yeah, and our mission today is basically to unpack why global labor markets have shown such surprising resilience. Especially considering the aggressive monetary tightening we've seen. We'll explore how this dynamic varies, quite significantly actually, across major economies, Europe, the US, Japan, and importantly, what these unexpected shifts mean for the future of monetary policy. We'll try to give you a concise understanding of these powerful forces at play.
Okay, so let's jump right in. For generations, the idea of taming inflation often came with a heavy cost, right? Rising unemployment. Economists even had that term for it, the sacrifice ratio, basically measuring how much output you lose to bring inflation down. The old thinking was, lowering inflation by 1 percentage point would typically cost about 1% of GDP. And that often meant a significant jump in joblessness. But as we've seen in the information we looked at, this current cycle has proven to be quite, unprecedented in striking ways. It's really defying those historical patterns.
It's truly fascinating. What we've seen is major central banks undertaking the most aggressive tightening in decades. Really sharp rate hikes. Yet in both the euro area and the United States, inflation has fallen sharply, but at a remarkably low cost in terms of jobs. Historically, you'd absolutely expect that 1 percentage point drop in inflation to come with significant economic pain, higher unemployment, slower growth. This time, though, we've seen something remarkably different. Employment stayed surprisingly robust. People are talking about soft landings or even immaculate disinflation.
That's almost counterintuitive, wouldn't you say? It really goes against what many expected, what those traditional economic models predicted. So, if this deviation is so significant, does it suggest we're in a completely new economic era? Or perhaps, are we just experiencing a lucky sort of convergence of factors that might not last?
That's the crucial question, really. The fact that we've seen disinflation without the expected jump in unemployment suggests unique forces are at play. Whether these are new structural changes or maybe a different type of economic shock or just a combination of both, well, that remains to be fully understood. It definitely challenges those long-held assumptions about the Phillips curve, that trade-off between inflation and unemployment. Getting a handle on these underlying drivers is vital for central bankers trying to navigate what comes next, especially if this resilience isn't, guaranteed to stick around.
Okay, let's zoom in on Europe then. ECB President Christine Lagarde highlighted some distinctive domestic drivers that explain Europe's surprisingly resilient labor market performance, even with major shocks. What were these key features? How did Europe manage to defy the expected slowdown?
Right. Based on the prepared resources, Europe's experience seems shaped by 3 interconnected factors. These allowed employment to grow stronger than historical patterns like Okun's law would predict. The first one, and it's quite significant, is a delayed wage response to inflation. See, unlike the 1970s when real wages shot up quickly after supply shocks, this time, real wages in the euro area actually fell by nearly 2% between late 2021 and early 2023.
Fell, despite high inflation.
Exactly, and a big part of that was the near disappearance of formal automatic wage indexation. It now applies to only about 3% of private sector employees. That's way down from roughly 50% back in the 70s. Plus, you have multi-year collective agreements covering about 60% of workers, which also created a lag. So this delay eased unit labor cost pressures for firms. That's the cost of labor per unit of output. It supported their profitability and basically encouraged them to keep hiring. In manufacturing, which got hit harder by energy shocks, real wages fell even more, almost 11%.
So instead of that quick cost spiral, Europe essentially bought some breathing room with wages. That allowed firms to adjust. Interesting. What's the second key driver?
The second feature is a reduction in average hours worked, rather than just cutting jobs outright. So even with strong employment growth, average hours worked actually declined. They're still about 1% below pre-pandemic levels. That's equivalent to maybe 1.3 million full-time jobs, less labor input in the euro area.
How did that happen? Less hours, but more jobs?
Well, 2 main reasons. First, labor hoarding. Firms chose to hold on to workers, especially in manufacturing. They saw it as less costly than trying to rehire later in a tight competitive market. The ECB's own indicator for labor hoarding nearly doubled its pre-pandemic average in late 2022. And second, there's a shift in worker preferences. We're seeing a structural trend towards shorter working hours, more part-time work, less overtime. And that compels firms to hire more people rather than just extending hours for their existing staff.
Ah, okay. So firms are holding on to staff like a long-term investment, and workers themselves are maybe choosing different work patterns. Sounds like it allowed more people into the workforce overall. What was the third crucial factor?
The third crucial element was a surge in labor supply. To actually sustain that employment growth with fewer average hours, the number of available workers had to expand significantly. And it did. The Euro area labor force grew by about 6 million people since late 2021. Now, some of this was increased participation from women and older individuals, continuing pre-pandemic trends. But crucially, foreign workers accounted for half of the labor force growth over the past 3 years. That's despite making up only about 9% of the total labor force back in 2022. This contribution from foreign workers was absolutely vital for GDP performance, especially in countries like Germany and Spain. Without it, things would have been much tighter.
So Europe's resilience really is this fascinating mix. The lagging wages acting as a buffer, firms hoarding labor, and this expanded workforce fueled significantly by immigration and changing demographics. It paints a picture of a European labor market that's sort of bent under pressure rather than breaking. But looking ahead, does this type of resilience have any, maybe, long-term ripples for Europe? Productivity, perhaps?
Absolutely, that's a valid concern. While Europe has shown this remarkable resilience, there's a worry these trends could weigh on labor productivity down the line. If lower job turnover continues, slowing down labor reallocation, workers moving to where they're most productive, it could make job matching less efficient. Combine that with an aging population, and Europe might escape that long-term unemployment trap, what economists call hysteresis, but maybe at the cost of slower productivity growth. Though it's worth adding, the potential impact of automation and AI, maybe spurred by a shrinking population, isn't fully baked into that view yet. That adds another layer of complexity.
Okay, let's shift gears now and turn our attention to the United States. Fed Chair Jerome Powell also spoke at Jackson Hole. He described a resilient U.S. economy, but one facing new challenges and a changing balance of risks. What did he highlight about the U.S. situation?
Right. As the provided information shows, the U.S. economy has indeed been resilient. However, Chair Powell used this phrase. He described the labor market as being in a curious kind of balance. On one hand, the unemployment rate is still historically low, 4.2% in July, but job growth has slowed quite significantly. It averaged only 35,000 per month over the last 3 months. Compare that to 168,000 per month during 2024.
Wow, that's a big slowdown.
It is, and this slowdown in job creation is matched by a softening in labor supply. That's partly due to tighter immigration policies, but also a slight dip in the labor force participation rate. So you have this unusual situation where both demand and supply for workers have cooled off together, and that, Powell suggested, raises important questions about rising downside risks to employment.
We also saw, various news commentary anticipating a more hawkish tone from Powell, suggesting maybe the market wasn't fully prepared for the Fed's stance. Given this curious balance in the labor market, how does the inflation picture fit into those shifting risks he mentioned?
Yeah, that's the critical balancing act for the Fed right now. According to Chair Powell, the risks around inflation are now tilted to the upside. But the risks around employment lean to the downside. That's a challenging spot for a central bank with dual mandates, price stability, and maximum employment. He pointed out that higher tariffs are clearly pushing up prices in some categories of goods. Core PCE prices, that's the Fed's preferred inflation measure, stripping out food and energy, rose 2.9% over the 12 months ending in July. And core goods prices actually increased 1.1% after seeing modest declines in 2024.
So inflation isn't fully cooperating?
Not entirely. And while Powell noted these tariff effects might be short-lived, there's always a risk of a more lasting inflation dynamic taking hold. So this puts the Fed in a tough position. He emphasized that while the policy rate is in restrictive territory, this shifting balance of risks, higher inflation risk, lower employment risk, may warrant adjusting the policy stance. But, and this is key, he stressed it's not on a preset course. They'll be cautious, data dependent.
Okay, so watchful waiting, basically. Now, beyond the immediate outlook, Powell also announced revisions to the Fed's monetary policy framework. That sounds pretty significant, like a longer-term strategic shift. What are the key takeaways from that update for us?
Yes, this is a crucial development. It really marks an adaptation to the economic conditions we've actually seen over the past 5 years. First, they removed language that highlighted the effective lower bound, ELB, basically, the zero interest rate problem, as the defining feature of the economic landscape. Instead, the new language emphasizes a strategy designed for a broad range of economic conditions. They acknowledge the difficulty near the ELB is still a potential concern, but it's no longer the primary focus it was after the financial crisis.
Okay, so let's focus on that specific lower bound problem. What else changed in their strategy?
Second, the Fed officially returned to a framework of flexible inflation targeting and, importantly, eliminated the makeup strategy. Remember that idea? Where they'd intentionally aim for inflation moderately above 2% for a while after periods when it ran below target.
Yeah, flexible average inflation targeting, FAIT.
Right. They've dropped that. Chair Powell basically acknowledged that the high inflation we saw post-pandemic made that strategy irrelevant, and frankly, it just complicated their communications.
That makes sense. It was hard to talk about aiming above 2% when inflation was already so high. So a big shift in communication there. What about their commitment to the 2% target itself?
Well, third, there's a stronger and clearer commitment to act forcefully to make sure longer-term inflation expectations stay well anchored at 2%. This is seen as absolutely essential for achieving both price stability and maximum employment, especially given the recent bout of high inflation. They really underscored that price stability is foundational.
Got it. Anchor those expectations firmly at 2%. And what about their approach to maximum employment? Did they tweak the definition or the focus there?
Yes, finally, they clarified their approach to maximum employment, specifically by removing the word shortfalls. The revised statement now says, and I'm paraphrasing slightly, that the committee recognizes employment might sometimes run above real-time estimates of its maximum level without necessarily creating inflation risks. However, it also explicitly notes that preemptive action would likely be warranted if labor market tightness or other factors do pose risks to price stability. So it's a subtle but important recalibration. They're acknowledging uncertainty about where maximum employment actually is, but they're also saying they won't ignore signs of overheating if inflation looks threatened. More flexible, but with clear red lines.
Okay. So the Fed is essentially updating its playbook based on everything that's happened recently, acknowledging the world changed, aiming for a more adaptable but still firm framework.
Precisely. It's about making sure their strategy works across a wider range of economic situations, learning lessons from both the low inflation, near zero rate era and the recent high inflation period, rather than just being stuck fighting the last war, so to speak.
Right. Okay, let's cross over to Japan now. Bank of Japan Governor Kazuo Ueda presented a unique perspective from their labor market. Japan, as we know, has faced these long-standing demographic challenges, declining population, low birth rates. How is its labor market responding to these really profound long-term trends, especially now with these shifts happening elsewhere?
Yeah, looking at the bigger picture, Japan offers a really fascinating contrast to the US and Europe. For decades, you had the situation where a declining population and various structural policies kind of masked an underlying tightness in the labor market. That led to prolonged economic stagnation, near zero inflation the lost decades. However, the BOJ's large-scale monetary easing since 2013, combined with the recent global inflation pressures, finally seems to have pushed Japan's inflation into positive territory. And critically, we are now seeing wages starting to rise. The spring wage negotiations in 2025 saw a pretty substantial 5.25% increase. That's a 34-year high. And this positive trend seems to be spreading, even to smaller businesses.
Wow, that is a huge shift for Japan, a country that battled deflation for so long. What are the specific dynamics behind this new wage growth, especially given those persistent demographic headwinds?
Well, according to the input sources, there are several factors at play, really showcasing Japan's unique approach. First, Japan has managed to achieve remarkably high labor participation rates. They've seen big increases among women. The rate for ages 15-64 hit 78% in June 2025, which is up there with Nordic countries. And participation among seniors, those over 65, is over 25% in 2024, the second highest in the OECD. But the potential for further increases from these groups is becoming somewhat limited. They're kind of reaching maximum potential there.
Okay, so they've really maximized their existing domestic labor pool. What else are they doing to find workers?
Second, foreign workers. While they're still only about 3% of the total labor force, they've had a huge impact recently. Foreign workers contributed over 50% to Japan's labor force growth between 2023 and 2024. That just highlights their increasing and really critical importance in offsetting those demographic declines.
That's a massive contribution from a relatively small group. Yeah. What about the internal dynamics? Is the job market itself changing?
Yes. Third, they're seeing increased labor market fluidity. Job mobility among regular employees, which was historically very low in Japan, is now rising, particularly for younger generations. This seems driven by intense competition for talent and, of course, those rising wages we just talked about. This movement of labor, from lower to higher productivity firms, is actually improving overall resource allocation in the economy. That's a positive sign for efficiency.
Interesting. More churn, more movement. And finally, how is technology fitting into this picture? Are they using it to cope with fewer workers?
Fourth, yes, capital labor substitution. Structural labor shortages are definitely accelerating investment in labor-saving technologies, particularly things like software in labor-intensive sectors, hospitality, retail. While AI adoption is still pretty early stage in many Japanese firms, this capital labor substitution is becoming a key driver of overall capital investment. And so far, Ueda noted, AI hasn't seemed to cause significant friction or unemployment. Youth unemployment is actually at a 30-year low. But the long-term impact of AI in fully offsetting population decline and labor shortages, well, that remains to be seen.
So if I'm getting this right, Japan is navigating its unique demographic storm with a kind of multi-pronged strategy, maximizing participation from everyone they can, strategically using foreign labor, encouraging a more dynamic job market, and leaning more heavily on technology. It really is a distinctive approach, isn't it? All contributing to this long-awaited wage revival.
You've got it exactly. Japan's experience really underscores how different economies can adapt to structural challenges, even really deep-seated ones like demographic decline. It shows a combination of policy and market dynamics can work. It's quite a testament to adaptability.
Okay, so as we bring this deep dive to a close, what are the sort of overarching themes, the future implications of all these global labor market shifts and monetary policy adjustments that you think we should all be watching for?
Well, a key question that comes out of all this is how sustainable these forces really are. While Europe and the US have shown this unexpected resilience, and Japan's got its own unique thing going on, central bankers are very aware these forces might not persist forever. The demographic trend, for instance, that's a global story now. There's new research suggesting 2023 might have been the first year in human history where the global fertility rate actually fell below the replacement rate the level needed just to keep the population stable.
Wow, globally below replacement.
Globally. That implies continued constraints on labor supply pretty much everywhere. It could limit future migration flows and reinforce trends like labor hoarding as firms just struggle to find enough workers. Now, while AI and automation offer potential productivity boosts, their full impact on offsetting these really widespread demographic headwinds, well, it's still highly uncertain.
It really sounds like central banks are bracing for an environment where the economic pictures we've seen just in the last few years are unlikely to simply repeat. Like the old economic rulebook just got a serious rewrite. Understanding the original nature of this cycle, as Lagarde put it, and the specific drivers in each region, Europe's wage lag, the U.S. balance, Japan's adaptation that seems crucial for being prepared for whatever comes next, rather than just relying on historical playbooks.
Absolutely. The focus now seems firmly on recognizing that the economic landscape is evolving, and policy frameworks need to be flexible enough to handle a much broader range of conditions than maybe we anticipated before.
What a journey through this intricate world of global labor markets and central bank thinking. We've seen how Europe defied expectations, resilient employment, thanks to those lagging wages, labor hoarding, the surge in foreign workers. We've explored how the U.S. navigates that curious balance, deals with new tariff challenges, and adapted its whole monetary policy framework. And we've learned how Japan is experiencing this long-awaited wage revival, despite deep demographic shifts, leveraging participation, foreign labor, fluidity, and tech. It's quite the mix.
Indeed. The insights from these central bank leaders really highlight that, while, yeah, there's much to learn from the past, we seem to be navigating a truly unprecedented or original cycle right now, and really encourages all of us to question assumptions and consider this evolving interplay of global and domestic factors rather than just waiting for the next carbon copy of a past event.
Well, thank you for joining us on this deep dive. We hope you're now feeling even more well-informed and maybe ready to connect these dots in your own thinking. What stands out to you the most from today's discussion? We'll leave you with this thought. As central banks continue to adapt their frameworks, like the Fed's recent changes, and as these demographic shifts deepen globally, how might their newfound flexibility and this cautious, data-dependent approach actually shape the next decade of global growth and stability? Could it even redefine what a normal economic cycle looks like?